Excuse me. Hello, hello, hello. All right, we are live. What's going on, guys? What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beats by Ash. Hold on, look at the camera real quick. What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beats by Ash, back at it again with another banger of a video, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the Burrow set review for Limited, primarily draft, but also for implications of sealed. Going to be grading all of the green, red, and black common and uncommons today. If you missed our first episode in the series where we started off with blue and white, as well as the gold cards, kind of giving the framework for what all of the different archetypes are trying to do within this limited format, make sure to go check that out on the YouTube channel. Unfortunately, my set review partner, Aoka Ortiz, is not going to be with us today. He is fortunately doing what any hardworking Mexican American would be doing, working on the construction site so that he can buy as many collector boosters as possible to open up later on the channel. But hopefully he will be back for the rares and mythics, which will take place in the final part of our series. So before we get into this, I will quickly go over the grading scale for today's ratings. We are going to be using the standard A, B, C, D, and F grading scale, as well as a secondary implication of the sideboard classification. A being cards that I believe are cards that are just good in all situations. Bombs, cards that you are very, very happy to be taking pack one, pick one. And then Bs are cards that pull me into an archetype, such as the red, white, gold card, makes me want to move into the mice archetype and be doing that thing because its payoffs are massive. Now, C's are your bread and butter limited cards. These are the cards that are going to be mostly compiled up of commons, cards that are strong role players, but typically are going to be best in whatever respective deck they are intended to be in. And then D's are cards that, if you have a very premium pool to be dealing with, you would prefer not to play them, but typically you have to play a couple of these just to make up your deck. Typically, these are cards that are very, very niche in their implications, but do play a role in a specific archetype, and if they are in the right engine, could be a valuable asset to your deck. And then Fs are obviously cards that are intended mainly for Commander as well as Constructed. And then the sideboard category is for my best 2 out of 3 lovers out there. These are cards that are very strong when put in against a specific matchup, but you probably don't want to put them in for best of 1. And by the way, fuck best of 1. But that's going to round off our card ratings. So let's go ahead and get into the goo. So without further ado, let's get into the goo. All right, we are back, and we're going to be starting off with the black, uncommon, and common cards, and then we're going to be moving on to red and green. So starting off with our first black common here, we have Agate Blade Assassin. This is 1 in a black for a 1/3 Lizard Assassin. And if you missed the first episode, understand that creature types are more important than ever in this set, as most of the decks you are going to be trying to make are going to be 2-color pairs that encompass 1 to 2 creature types that synergize very, very well for each other. So this card is a 2-cost 1/3 Lizard Assassin, and whenever it attacks, defending player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So we know that the red-black Lizard deck is all about your opponent losing life on your turn, and this does enable that, but at a cost of if this just doesn't kill one of your opponent's creatures and they have a blocker that kills it and you lose your guy, then you're losing a card to be able to trigger one of your other cards. I feel like the effect is pretty strong, and if you can buff it up, it could be pretty decent, but I don't think this is something that you are hard looking for, even in the Lizard Assassin deck. You probably wouldn't cut this from your Lizard deck, but at the same time, you would probably prefer to just have other enablers, and so that's why I'm going to have to give this a C-, specifically in the Lizard deck. Anyone else who is not playing the Lizard deck is not going to want this at all, so you can probably get these very late. All right, moving on, our next card is Boned-Bide Orator. This is 1 and a black for a 2/2 Squirrel Warlock Bard. And the ability reads, you may pay 3 and a black, exile this from your graveyard, return another target creature from your graveyard to your hand. So this is actually a very interesting card. I think the main implication for this is going to be in the Threshold deck, which is blue-black, if I am correct. Threshold is a mechanic that triggers your abilities as long as you have 7 or more cards in the graveyard. And there are quite a few cards in this set that allow you to either self-mill or surveil off the top of your deck. And I think this is a card that, unlike some of the other cards we have seen that are more beneficial in the graveyard than they are actually on the field, this isn't really that bad to draw. It's still a 2-mana 2/2, and perhaps you may not even cut this from one of your aggressive red-black Lizard decks. I don't think is the most optimal there, but ideally you're looking to mill this with another effect and then just have that ability available in your graveyard. Now that is an instant speed ability, so that is very relevant. I'm pretty sure you're probably not going to want a bunch of these just because it's not the best card to draw, but being a 2-mana 2/2 means that it is not the worst, and maybe you can easily trade it with something on the board. If you're trading it for a game piece in the early game, then being able to buy back something else in the late game, especially if it's like a bomb or one of your best cards, that's probably going to be pretty valuable. So I think this is probably a C level card, maybe a C+. It's going to be very dependent on how easily are you able to create that threshold barrier. Because another thing we have to think about here is if you're playing the threshold deck, this is essentially removing 2 cards from the graveyard, which could be an inhibitor, which makes me think the first copy is probably relatively good, and then the second and third copy is probably going to be very dependent on how much self-mill you have, and very often you're probably going to cut those copies from the deck. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a C. All right, our next card is Daggerfang Duo. Now, Duo cards are in every single color, and this is a subset of cards that essentially have 2 creature types, meaning that they were intended to be put into 2 different 2-color archetypes. This is 2 and a black for a 3/2 Rat Squirrel Death Touch. When this enters, you may mill 2 cards. I think that this is actually doing a lot for you. In your Threshold decks, it mills 2 cards, and you can then trade it off for something else, which then puts a total of 3 cards in the graveyard, which seems very, very valuable at its current cost. And then as well, even in your red-black decks, it is a card that threatens damage, potentially triggering your when an opponent lost life effects during your turn. And if they trade with, they don't really want to trade with it because you have Death Touch. So I think it has implications in both of those decks. Personally, I'm thinking that this is probably going to be a C+, just because multiple archetypes are fine with this, and one archetype is pretty happy with it. This card is going to be a very good curve filler within that Threshold deck. So let's go ahead and give this one a C+. Let me shut the door real quick. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a C+ and move on. Very nice card. All right, our next card is Dire Sight. This is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Surveil 2, then you draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. So 3 mana for a divination, but you also get the option to be able to surveil. I think this card is pretty much only going to be wanted in the Threshold deck, but in the Threshold deck, that is a relatively nice ability, considering that if you're able to surveil 2 to the graveyard with this, you are almost halfway to Threshold relatively early in the game. If you play this card and you had just played the Squirrel with Death Touch and you played this on turn 4, you might be immediately, about to hit Threshold, which is pretty nice. I'm not exactly sure at what point you need to be hitting Threshold in the game in order for the deck to be successful, but I assume by turn 4, turn 5, you really need to hit Threshold or you're probably not going to be able to stabilize the game. But I think this is a very good card within that deck. Those decks will probably want like 1 or 2 copies of this. So I think probably a C+ in the Threshold deck, and then probably like a D in all of the other decks. Our next card is Early Winter. This is 4 and a black instant. Exile target creature. Target opponent exiles. Choose one. Exile target creature or target opponent exiles an enchantment they control. So we've seen 5 mana kill spells to be cards in previous sets where you don't really want to play this, but depending on what deck you're in, you will play this if you aren't able to access the more premium removal spells. So I think this is probably going to be a D+. What's really hurting this from being a C is the fact that your opponent gets to choose which enchantment gets exiled, which really, really hurts this effect. And I think we've seen more powerful versions of this card basically perform at like a D+ regardless. So I don't see this being any better. All right, moving on, we have Glide Dive Duo. This is 4 and a black for a 3/3 bat lizard creature with flying. When this enters, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Wow, that's really good. So I think this is more so for the bat deck than it is for the lizard deck. But depending on how your curve is in the lizard deck, I could see this just being a decent curve topper for that deck. But what I really see the power in this card is if you were able to chain them back to back. Because if you're able to play 1 on 5, 1 on 6 in the bats deck, you have now done 4 damage, potentially another 3, because the turn that you play this, since you're gaining 2 life, you can allow your opponent to attack without blocking, then get in for another 3. And at that point, by the time you play the second one, you've done a minimum of 7 damage. And that's assuming you haven't done any damage before turn 5. So at minimum, they're going to be at 13. And I think this card is very good in multiple copies within the bat deck. So I'll probably give this a C, considering it's pretty good in the bat deck and like you might want one in the lizard deck. Moving on, we have Nocturnal Hunger. This is 2 and a black instant. Destroy a target creature and you can gift a food. If the gift was not promised, you lose 2 life. Wow, this is really good. This is actually very, very nice. I think cards like this tend to overperform. And I think we've seen a trend in previous standard sets where black typically has the best removal, but sometimes they don't have other things going on. So I think if black isn't one of the best things to be doing, this is going to be a C+. You're never cutting it from any black deck. But if black is already one of the better colors with their creatures, with their, their proactive cards, then this card could easily be a B-, just because you would want to prioritize it more highly. And I think this is just a safe option to start with. Regardless, like if the pack is low power level and there's nothing specifically pulling you in one direction, I don't think you can go wrong with this, because every single black deck is going to be fine with this. 3 is pretty good. And in the early game, you're always going to be losing 2 life. Later in the game, where you might be on the back end, then you're going to be giving them the food because you don't want to lose the 2 life. But overall, this is just a very versatile card. And especially considering we are now down to only 1 Planeswalker per set, the optionality of not being able to destroy a Planeswalker really does not matter as much as it used to. So I think this card's great. I'm going to go ahead and give it a C+, but we could upgrade that to a B- if black is one of the better colors to be starting in general. Our next card is Psychic Whirl. This is 2 and a black sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards. If you control a rat, surveil 2. So blue-black is the surveil deck, and it also is the rats deck. So I think within that shell, this is probably a C-level card. It's hard to say whether you're going to want this more than you are going to want the Dire Sight, which is the surveil 2, then draw 2. I think that this card is probably a little bit worse than that card, because although you are trying to play the rats deck, with the draw spell, you don't have to have a creature on board. So when you're in that archetype, even if you don't have that already, that game piece already present, that card is still alive. Whereas with this card, if you don't have a rat, I just don't think it's really that good. So I'm honestly just gonna rate this a D+, because only one deck really wants this, and even within that deck, I think there's just like slightly better variations of this effect that you could be using within that archetype. But I think you probably will not cut this, you know, if you don't have other copies of things to enable your threshold. Next up, we have Ravine Raider. This is 1 black for a 1/1 Lizard Rogue with Menace, and you can pay 1 and a black. This creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. So this is a turn 1 game piece that is almost always going to be able to trigger your opponent losing life on the very first turn it can attack, which I think is very relevant because it works very well with the red-black 2-cost gold card that allows you to exile the top 2 cards of your deck and then play one in the same turn that you lost, that your opponent lost life. So this card is probably okay in that deck. I don't know how many of these that you actually want. I mean, obviously later in the game, I think it's a lot less relevant and probably just a dead draw. But there are, you know, many ways to surveil and get rid of things like that. I personally think that the paying 1 and a black ability is pretty irrelevant. I think it's just more so about, like, how many things do you have at the 2-drop and 3-drop slot that require your opponent to have lost life this turn in order for you to get value out of those effects. And if that number is relatively high, you're probably going to be wanting these. And if the cards that, you know, demand your opponent losing life in your deck are a little bit higher costed, you probably just won't want this card as much. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a C- because I think within the right engine, it could be a very good card, a very consistent way to trigger your abilities off of your lizards, but overall it is just a very bad draw after the first turn of the game. Our next card is Savor. This is 1 and a black instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Create a food token. So I think this card is actually very reasonable to be played within any deck, but I think that the green-black forage deck is going to be most interested in this because the food gives them the most value. I think in a normal set, this probably would not be as good, but what really puts this over the top is that this seems to be a very low-costed, the game starts on turn 1 type of format where a lot of the most powerful cards we have seen thus far are 1-drops. And a lot of the most powerful cards are aggressively slanted cards, which do not have the highest health, which I think puts this card in a higher regard. You know, we saw a similar type of effect being rat out from Wilds of Eldraine, which was 1 mana, give something -1/-1, create a rat token, which we had the mechanic known as Bargain, which is similar to Forage, being that you could sacrifice not only a food, but also a token. And this card kind of serves the same role. But this set is overall just lower costed, lower HP, more aggressive on average. So I think this card is probably pretty good. I think this is probably a C+, because I think you're probably not cutting this from any of your black decks, but you probably are pretty high in demand for this card within the Forage decks. All right, our next card is Scales of Shale. This is 2 and a black instant. This spell costs 1 colorless less to cast for each lizard you control. Target creature gets +2/0 and gains lifelink and indestructible until the end of turn. So this is a very interesting card because I do think indestructible is pretty valuable. The only issue I have with this card is that Valiant is with the Valiant keyword, which is the keyword that triggers your abilities whenever a creature you control is targeted by something, is not within the color black. It is only found within red and white, which I think holds this back a little bit. I will say that the Lizard deck is about getting on board early and playing a, generally speaking, very go-wide game plan. So I think very often this is going to cost 1. And if your deck can consistently make this cost 1, you're probably fine playing 1 to 2 copies of this. But I am not that big of a fan of cards that require A to happen in order for B to occur or B to be beneficial to you. And I think if you're paying more than one mana to play this, it's probably not that great and something you really don't want to be doing. It's also important to note that if you have a lot of creatures with menace, this may not be as beneficial to you because you're already getting through anyway. So it really depends on the type of creatures that you have, how their triggers work. If you were using that 1/3 that caused an opponent to lose life and you gain a life whenever it attacks, then this would be a very good target for that, right? So I think it's very dependent on not only how many lizards you have, number one, how many early game lizards you have, and how many of them are already not efficient attackers, right? So overall, I think this is probably just a D+ card, but you could very easily play more than one copy within the Lizard deck. I just don't know the Lizard deck really shapes up to be one of the best decks yet. And I also just think that there are other cards that require less work in order to be effective. Next up, we have Starlit Soothsayer. This is 2 and a black for a 2/2 Bat Cleric with flying. And at the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, Surveil 1. So 3 mana for a 2/2 with the potential to Surveil 1 with flying. I think 3 mana 2/2 flyers are already pretty decent. And I think within the Bats deck, this is a relatively decent effect. Potentially having some overlap within the Threshold deck as well, because Threshold is more interested in the Surveil than anything. But I don't think you really want this in the Lizards deck, just because you're looking to be more aggressive within that archetype. So I think this is probably a C-. I think within the Bats deck, it's probably going to be the best, but I think just as well, the Threshold deck wouldn't mind having this. So let's go with a C-. All right, our next card is Thornplate Intimidator. 3 and a black for a 4/3 Rat Rogue, Offspring 3, meaning that you may pay 3 to create a 1/1 copy of this card. When this creature enters, target opponent loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Honestly, I think this card is very underwhelming. This might even be an F. Number one, the Offspring cost being 3 and the card already costing 4. If you want to get the maximum value out of this card, you're paying 7, which I don't think, even if the ability is more impactful than it actually was, would be a good card to be playing just because of how fast the format is. And when you think about like the decks that this would actually be good in, those decks are already pretty fast anyway, which really deter from the value from this card. On top of the essence that the opponent gets to choose which one of the effects is going to be least negatively impacting them, which is honestly really dumb because even if it didn't have that optionality for your opponent to choose to sack a non-land or discard a card, I don't even think the card would be that good, because even paying 7 mana for 5/4 worth of stats and then your opponent gets rid of the 2 least impactful objects that are in their possession, that's just not a good effect. You know, so I just don't really see this card being playable. I would honestly rate this a D minus, maybe even an F. If you have to play it, I guess you can throw it in. But overall, I think 9 out of 10 times, you are doing everything you can to not play this. All right, now we are going to take a look at our first class card from Black. This is Bandit's Talent, which is 1 in a black, level 1. When this enters, each opponent discards 2 cards, unless they discard a non-land card. You can pay 1 black to increase this to level 2. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards, they lose 2 life. And then level 3 is 3 in a black. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So I do think that this is actually a pretty decent effect. I just don't really see that you are wanting this card within the Bats deck being the most applicable for this effect, or even the Lizard deck. Just because those decks are already very aggressive, and those decks and most decks in the format in general seem to be strongly about get on board early and do not lose control of the board. And I think 9 out of 10 times, you're just not going to have a good window to be able to play this card, even though I think that the abilities are pretty decent. So I think this is probably just a D- level card. You know, if you don't have a lot of 2-drops and you pick it up for the curve filler, I can understand that. But ultimately, you're looking to not play a card like this because it doesn't advance your game state, which seems relatively important within the first 3 turns of the game for this entire set. Our next card is Bone Cache Overseer. 1 black, 1/1, Squirrel Warlock. Tap this, pay 1 life, draw a card. Activate if only if 3 or more cards left your graveyard this turn, or if you've sacrificed a food this turn. So I think this card is actually very, very strong. If you're able to just draw 1 card from this, it already pays for itself, and you know, you don't feel bad that you put this in your deck. And if you can consistently do this more than 1 time, even 3 times, then this card is absolutely amazing. Obviously, you have to have the right setup for this, but this is very nice because it can trigger even if you sacrifice a food to gain the health. You don't just have to forage, which makes this card a little bit better. And I think this card is very low opportunity cost. So I think I'm going to give this a B-, because as long as you have the right setup for it, I think it's going to be well worth its weight, especially because in the Forge deck, you don't really have a lot of amazing turn 1 plays to be doing, to my knowledge. So I think that makes this card a little bit overall better in that archetype. Next up, we have Consumed by Greed. This is 1 and 2 black. Target opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. This is at instant speed, and then you may gift them a card. If the gift was promised, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So on average, you're going to get their best creature out of the way at instant speed, which seems relatively decent. 3 is a little bit too much to be paying for that on its own, but the added optionality of being able to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand does make this a little bit better. This is kind of a card that I think is hinged on the back of, like, does your deck have powerful things that are worth grabbing back from the grave? Because if you're playing the Threshold deck, the one thing that sticks out to me about this card is if you have a bomb, then this card gives you insurance that you don't accidentally mill your bomb, and then you lose that for the rest of the game, which I do like about this card. But I think decks other than the Threshold deck are very moderately to low interested in this card. So I think I'm going to give this card a C, Also, double black is somewhat difficult to have available since there is minimal fixing in this set early in the game where this is going to be the most relevant. So let's go with C. Our next card is Downwind Ambusher. This is 3 in a black, 4/2 for a skunk assassin with flash. When this enters, target creature an opponent controls get -1/-1 until end of turn, or destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So typically, cards that have the ability to destroy something that was previously damaged tend to underperform because once people understand that this is a thing that they need to play around, the effect becomes very, very low impact and very rarely actually occurs. But the optionality of being able to give something -1/-1 with all of the offspring tokens going around mean that on average, you're going to be killing something a decent amount of the time, which I do think this card makes this card quite a bit better than the previous assassinate effects that we've seen in other sets. So I would probably say that this is a C level card at best, probably a C-. And the other thing is, I don't think any deck in particular is really looking to have this because it doesn't give you any typal bonuses. So it does have that negative aspect going for it. So maybe it's more likely going to be a C-. But it's definitely not like terrible. If you have to play one of these, I think it's fine as long as you're not in the red-black deck, because I think that deck tends to be a little more lower to the ground on average. Our next card is Feed the Cycle. 1 in a black instant. As an additional cost, you may pay 1 black or forage. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. So this is either 3 to destroy target creature or planeswalker, or 2, and then you also have to forage. So as we just discussed about the 3-mana common variant of this spell killing something, and then you either gift them something or you lose 2 life, I think this is obviously the more premium version of that effect, and this is easily going to be a B-. The forage decks are really going to love this, and everyone else is going to be completely satisfied who's playing black as well to just play this card. But in the forage deck, this card is absurd because being able to kill anything for only 2 mana and also potentially trigger your other forage effects while also doing that at instant speed is pretty damn ridiculous. So I think this is probably just a straight up B. It is also important to note that this can kill planeswalkers, which is pretty cool because, you know, we do have, you know, some of the other planeswalkers, not just Squirrel Roll. We do have a couple on the bonus sheet, which could come up every now and again, you know. Our next card is Fell. F-E-L-L. 1 in a black sorcery, destroy target creature. Wow. Black has some very premium interaction. This card is nice. I honestly am not sure whether this is like on the same threshold level as the previous card we just looked at that, you know, can destroy a target creature or planeswalker but enables your forage stuff. But it is more versatile, like more decks are going to want this. I think just 2 mana kill something, even though it's sorcery, is pretty damn good. And I think you're never going to be dissatisfied starting with this, or just you're never cutting this in your deck, and you would like as many of these as possible. So I'm going to give this a B-. Our next card is Hazel's Nocturne. 3 in a black instant, return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Each opponent loses 2 and you gain 2. So this is a very weird card because you would assume this is the most relevant within the threshold deck since it has the most access to self-mill. But the lose 2, gain 2 doesn't really benefit that that deck as much as it would the red-black Lizards deck or even the white-black Bats deck. So I'm not really sure that this card is too enticing to any one deck. I think it's a card that if you have a bomb that you actually like care about and you don't want to accidentally mill it, you're probably fine playing one copy of this. But once again, with cards like this, especially a higher cost version, there really needs to be a reason for you to be deliberately putting this into your deck. And if you don't have a good reason to be buying something back that you feel is generally going to be more powerful than most of the other cards your opponent has access to, you probably would prefer to not get this card at all in any of your decks. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a C- because I think the second copy is a lot worse than the first copy. And I think not everyone is going to be interested in a card like this, especially since there are other options to buy back. You could probably make an argument that the one that gifts something version of this effect is just generally way better. All right, moving on to the Elemental for black. Elemental is just a random type that doesn't have any synergy with the other creature types that you're building your decks around, the tribal types, but tend to be just very versatile, strong cards for each color. This is Husk Burster Swarm, 7 and a black elemental insect for a 6/6. This costs 1 less to cast for each creature card you own in exile and in your graveyard, and contains Menace and Death Touch. So realistically, you are very, very happy if you're able to cast this for 5 or less, which I think is relatively easily done when a lot of the cards in these decks allow you to surveil too. Sometimes putting 3 cards in the graveyard, sometimes 4. And I think by the time you get to turn 5, if your deck is trying to mill and you are trying to do the threshold thing, then this is probably going to be at the cost you want to play it at. And even later in the game, this could cost as low as 3. So I think this card is great, and I would honestly give this a C+, because I think it is a powerful card, but I think you need to be deliberately trying to achieve threshold. Even foraging could be beneficial for this, but I think not everyone's interested in it, and that's why I think it's lower than a B for me. All right, our next card is Moonstone Harbinger. This is 2 and a black for a 1/3 Bat Warrior Flying Death Touch. When you gain or lose life during your turn, bats you control get +1/+0 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. This ability only triggers once each turn. So I think flying 1/3 Death Touch for 3 is already relatively good. And I think if you can trigger this ability at least 1 time per game, this is pretty much a solid card. So I think this is going to be a C+, because you do have to do some work to achieve the full ceiling of this card. But if you don't consistently achieve the full ceiling of this card, the stat line is still pretty decent. You know, there are a lot of like 2 attack, 1 attack creatures, and 3 toughness is very good. So I think as long as you have the possibility to trigger this effect, you know, once per match, I think it's a pretty strong card. You know, obviously, you're mainly only going to want this in the Bats deck, but I think it could also be potentially fine in the Lizard deck, just because it is a good way to be able to push through some damage and trigger your other when your opponent loses life effects. So overall, a pretty good card. Our next card is Persistent Marshstalker. This is 1 and a black for a 3/1 Rat Berserker. Persistent Marshstalker gets +1/+0 for each other rat you control. So it is essentially a Singular Lord. And then it has Threshold. When you attack with one or more rats, if you have Threshold, you may pay 3. And if you do, return this from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. Wow. That is really good. I mean, you play this on turn 2. You start getting in. And then if you attack later on, and you've traded this away and you get this back one time, then you're just getting so much bang for your buck. I mean, even if you just have one rat, which is what's required to trigger this ability, you're getting in for 4, and you either trade it away for a game piece or a removal in the early game, maybe did 3 damage. This card's great. I think honestly in the Threshold decks, this is going to be a huge incentive to be doing the Threshold thing. It's a great payoff, and it gives you some early aggression in a deck archetype where I feel like part of the time you might have to take off a turn from developing just to get to Threshold. I think this is exactly the kind of card that you need, and it's also an amazing card to mill. Cards that are good on field and good when you mill them are great in the Threshold deck because you don't have to sacrifice one of those 2 elements when you are constructing your deck during the draft. So this is going to be an easy B- for me. Maybe even just a straight B. Next card up is Ruthless Negotiation. 1 black for a sorcery. Target opponent exiles a card from their hand. If this was cast from the graveyard, draw a card with a flashback cost of 4 and a black. So this is a very interesting card. I think this is really only fine in the Threshold deck, but it is a good card to mill and a mediocre card to draw, especially since I want to restate how important it feels like at this point to be developing the board early and getting on board early. You know, we've seen some aggressive 1-costed cards. I don't know that you're always wanting to have to play this on turn 1. And since you're going to be wanting to use all of your mana every turn, but I guess it is a 1-cost way to put something into the graveyard for Threshold, which could be pretty decent. I think this card is good, but considering it's only desirable within the Threshold space, it's probably a C- level card, and especially because I don't think you want more than one of this. In the Threshold deck, you know, the last card we saw was a prime example of the best of both worlds, the most premium type of cards that you're going to be wanting when you play in this space. Cards that are valuable in hand and as well equally valuable in grave. This card sacrifices the valuability of this card in hand and gives you more of a bang for your buck in the grave, which to me says that I don't want to be prioritizing this card, and there's a risk associated with playing this. Because if this card has to stay in your hand for 3 turns before you actually, get to put it in the grave, that is a cost that I think a lot of people would not think about. And I just don't think you're going to want more than one of this card within that deck, maybe 2 at the most, just because that is a huge cost. The more you add into your deck, the more of an upfront cost you're paying, which makes me think 1 is okay, and any more than that is probably just going to give you depreciating results, right? So I think the card is fine. I'm going to give it a C- since it's only used in really 1 deck. Next up, we have Sinister Monolith. This is 3 and a black for an artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each opponent loses 1 and you gain 1 with an additional ability to tap, pay 2 life, sacrifice this artifact, and draw 2 cards. And this ability is at sorcery speed. So this is a very interesting card. I think it would seem like at first glance that you were most interested in this in the red-black lizard deck, but it also does have some overlap within the white-black bats deck, since you are gaining a life. My question is, how relevant is it that you are doing this effect at the beginning of combat? Because I do know that there are some cards that give you the bonus if you did something in the second main phase or the first main phase, right? So that makes this card kind of weird. And it is 4. I think the second ability to be able to sack this and draw 2 is probably not the most relevant, because if you're putting this into your deck, it's because your deck like incentivizes you to be getting an immediate way to trigger your abilities that depend on loss or gain of life. So I think that second ability is really just a failsafe for if you don't have access to cards that have synergy with this, which makes me think that this card is okay, but it's not especially desirable in either of the two decks. I think it's more desirable within the bat space, just because it feels like that deck is a little less aggressive than the lizard deck. We have to think that the lizard deck is a very low cost, low to the ground deck, and taking off a turn to spend 4 mana and do nothing is probably a relatively higher cost for that deck than it would be for the Bats deck, which in the Bats deck, you could be stalling with a flyer that has Death Touch, such as the 1/3 cost variant Bat that we saw previously, which means you might be able to get away with putting this on the field. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a C-, especially since I think there is a depreciating cost of playing a second one of these in your deck, because it's just unrealistic that you're going to be able to take off 2 back-to-back turns without creating any effect on advancing your game state. But I think it's a decent card within the bat space, maybe in the lizard space as a curve topper, depending on how easily you can get your opponent down. If you're able to just like by turn 4, just get them down to like less than 10 health, then maybe this effect is pretty relevant, but we'll have to see. Yo, what's up, Arconi? How are you doing, my guy? All right, our next card is Stargaze. This is 2 black and X for a sorcery. Look at twice X cards from the top of your library. Put X cards from among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. You lose X life. So let's say you're paying 4 for this. That means that you're going to be able to look at 4 cards, put 2 of them into your hand, 2 into your grave, and then you lose 4 life. I'm doing pretty good, brother. I'm just trying to get through all these in a timely manner, because we have a lot to go, my friend. And that's why today we're only going to be tackling the remainder of the commons, and next time we're going to go into the rares and mythics. But I'm going to try to get these out as soon as possible, because I know a lot of other people have already gotten out their ratings, and I know some people are already going to be playing in their pre-release weekends this weekend. So if you're paying 4 mana to look at 4, draw 2, and put 2 into the graveyard, and lose 4, and then you're also putting a 3rd card in the graveyard, that seems pretty relevant. I think this card is good, but I don't think you want more than 1. I think this is a good late game piece of recursion, a good way to, get back in on card advantage. But I think that assuming you're going to be paying 2 or more, which is going to give you, the minimum least amount of value that you need to really make this card worth it, it feels like you kind of have to be ahead. Because if you're spending 4 mana to not advance your game state, that seems like a high cost to be paying when you're like on turn 4 of the game and you're losing 4 life. With how aggressive this set is shaping up to be. So I think this is probably, the first copy is probably very strong in the Threshold deck. And I think past that, it's going to depend on how deep your curve is and how many payoffs you have for actually getting things from the graveyard. For example, if you have like 2 or 3 persistent Marshstalker, then maybe that card is very good, because you're getting to look at 4 cards to potentially put this card into the graveyard. And if you're doing that, then it essentially makes that card say that you're going to be drawing 3 instead of drawing 2, which is a drastically huge difference. And then you're also just developing your game state. So you're not taking off as much of a tempo swing, which I do think is a big factor in whether Stargaze is going to be correct for your deck. And I don't think that anyone else is really that interested in this card, since most of the other black decks are decks that are not controlling, right? Maybe in the black-green deck, you might have some interest in this, but I think overall, because it is double black, this is probably just going to be a C-level card. Maybe a C+ if you have a bomb, right? Because I think a lot of cards like this get way better, and your incentive to play them drastically increases if you have a game-ending bomb. Because looking at 4 cards is a lot, but if you're going to guarantee you accessing a bomb on the following turn, you're essentially mitigating that tempo loss, which I think is a very important part of the equation to whether this card is correct for your deck. I'm wondering if there's a secret combo, maybe Shouldered, then this card next turn. Ooh, that does sound very good. The question is, you're not drawing the cards, though, so you wouldn't be able to trigger the Shouldered. Yeah, I don't know how beneficial that would be. I think it's going to depend on your graveyard effects. Because being able to... since it doesn't say up to the amount, like it said, if it said up to X, this card would be way better, right? This card reads put X cards from among them into your hand. If it said put up to X, that would drastically change my opinion on this card, because then you could potentially mill 4 cards and put this into the graveyard. That means you're putting 5 cards into the graveyard for your threshold, which is almost guaranteed if you're playing this on turn 4. And if you're playing this on turn 6, it's a guaranteed threshold under that circumstance, even if you don't have anything in the grave. So I think that really hurts the viability on this card. So we're just going to go with C. I think it's fine. Next up, we have Starscape Cleric. This is 1 and a black for a 2/1 Bat Cleric creature. Offspring cost of 3. Offspring being create a 1/1 copy of this. With flying, this creature can't block. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So the Offspring cost is relatively high, but the floor on this card is also very high. I mean, 2 mana for a 2/1 with flying is pretty decent. Now, I think what's really holding back this card is it does have a high ceiling, but you do have to do work for it to be valuable to your deck. Like, I think there has to be some amount of a chance for you to be able to turn this ability online before you're, like, moderately interested in playing this card. Now, if you have many ways to be able to gain life, you have a lot of life linkers, a lot of cards, maybe like the Monolith, then this card is probably relatively high in demand for your Bats deck. But considering no other deck is really moderately to high in interest for this card, I think this is most likely just going to be a C+. Because in the Bats deck, it is a very good payoff, and the Offspring cost is reasonable, giving you that modularity of playing it on 2 and 5. But if you can't consistently trigger the ability, I don't think it's as valuable. I think it's just okay. But I mean, 2 mana for a 2/1 flying isn't the worst. So it's probably a decent card within the some of the other black decks, just because flying could be relevant to you. Next up, we have Thoughtstalker Warlock. This is 2 and a black for a 2/2 Lizard Warlock with Menace. When this enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, they reveal their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card. Otherwise, they discard a card. So essentially, if your opponent lost life when this entered the battlefield, you get to Thought Seize them. And if they didn't, you're making your opponent discard their worst card, and you're still getting a 3 mana 2/2 with Menace. Wow, this card is insane. I honestly would go as far to say that you're probably still interested in this card, even if you're not in the Lizard archetype. Just because the floor on this card is so high. At worst, it's a 3 mana 2/2 with Menace. And at best, it's a Thought Seize with 2/2 and Menace. That's ridiculous. Like, this card is insane. And it does have the Lizard type, which is also very relevant. I think, honestly, like, depending on how many flyers you have, you could be interested in this in the Threshold deck as well. Like, this is just a really strong card. And I think it's a fair card to start with in the draft. I think I'm going to go with B- on this, just because the floor is so high. Now, if you're not able to consistently trigger this ability early, the impact isn't, like, insane, but it's still just good. So I think B- is fair. And probably B in the Lizard deck in general. Moving on to our last black uncommon here, we have Wix Patrol. This is 4 and 2 black for a 5/3 Rat Warlock creature. When this enters, mill 3 cards. When you do, target a creature an opponent controls gets -X/-X until the end of the turn, where X is the greatest mana value among cards in your graveyard. Wow. This card is amazing. Yeah, this card is absolutely insane. What I really like about this card is, number one, it's not the highest cost among the cards you just milled. It's whatever you have in the graveyard. Number two, unlike some other cards we have seen, it's not just the highest costed creature card. It's the highest costed mana value card, so it can be a spell as well, which is really relevant. And I mean, 5 attack is pretty good. I think honestly, if you're trying to mill, this card is insane. Because worst case scenario, you're getting to enable your threshold. And if you are already at the point where you have 6 mana, I would like to assume that about 90% of the time, this is going to be enabling your threshold if you do not already have threshold. And with so many ways to manipulate the graveyard, I feel like this card on average is going to be minimum -3, -3, even -2, -2, since there's a lot of powerful 1 and 2 drops that are difficult to answer. And this card is just a great blocker. I think this is just a B level card that I'm probably willing to start off pack 1, pick 1. Yeah, this card has high utility. Mill creature or board wipe, yeah. Because you can kind of think of this card as remove 2 creatures. Because it does have 3 toughness. So I think more often than not, it's probably going to die. But if you take down one of their creatures, even a medium-sized one, by blocking it with this, since it does have 5 attack, that's amazing. Because then you will have put 4 cards into the graveyard and traded a 1 for 2, which is just great. So I think this is just a B across the board. Threshold decks are going to be more interested in this than other decks. But I do think that the Forage deck is probably going to be relatively interested in this as well. Especially because that is a more later game deck in the regards of how fast the format is compared to the other archetypes. Which makes this overall just a very diverse card to have in any deck. And the floor is just really high. Plus, it's a rat, and as many of you may know, I am the Rat King. All right, that's going to be our last black card. Now, we're going to go ahead and move on to red. One moment. Please wait. I am uploading the cards. Hold on, sir. Hold on. We're about to start. All right, moving on to our first red common, we have Agate Assault. This is 2 in a red sorcery. Choose one. Either deal 4 damage to a target creature, and if that creature would die, it is exiled instead, or exile target artifact. So we saw a 2-cost variant of the 4 damage and exile something in Modern Horizons 3, and that card was very strong. And considering Modern Horizons sets are supposed to be relatively higher power level than any standard set, I think this effect is still very beneficial at 3 mana. And I think even without the additional artifact interaction, this would still be a very valuable card to have and something you would never cut from a deck. But given that it allows you to target an artifact as well, and that is an exile effect, I think that is really relevant in a set where there is a lot of graveyard recursion, a lot of graveyard effects of that specific card in general. So I think this is probably just a C+ card that you're never going to be unhappy to include in any deck. And I think, honestly, you're very welcome and happy to be playing 2 to 3 copies of this card, just knowing the stat lines of the average powerful card in this set overall. 4 damage is going to be very, very easily killing most of the big threats in this format. All right, our next card is Alania's Pathmaker. This is 3 in a red for a 4/2 Otter Wizard, and when this enters, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. So what I really like about this card is that it's until the end of your next turn, not until the end of this turn, which I think is very relevant on a fairly high-costed card. It also does have the Otter keyword, which is relevant in its own right. It is just 1 card, though. So let's say this is just draw a card. If it's 4 mana, 4/2 draw a card, I don't even know how happy you are about that, because this is not even that. Because you may not even be able to play that card, and it still requires mana on the following turn, even if you don't do it this turn. And it shows your opponent what that card is, which does remove a little bit of that value. So I think this card is probably a C-, especially considering the fact that the red-blue Otters deck is primarily a deck where you want to have a minimal amount of creatures. I just don't think the stat line is cutting it for me. The 2 toughness just really hurts this card. But I think you probably include this. It's just a filler card you're going to get late. And then no one else is really interested in this. I mean, maybe the Threshold deck, because it is... I mean, not Threshold. Maybe the 4-cost Matters deck, the Expend deck, where you're rewarded for spending 4 or more of your mana in 1 turn, might be interested in this. But I just think it's a very niche card. All right, moving on to Conduct Electricity. This is 4 in a red instant. This deals 6 damage to one target creature and up to 2 damage to a target token creature. I think once again we saw a 5 mana removal spell within black, and that card was probably a D+. This card is probably a D+ or a C-. 5 mana is just a lot to be spending. I think it's easily said that this card is way better within the Otter space than it is in other decks, because in the Otters deck you can reduce this cost to 4 with the red, blue, gold card, which I think this card makes this card quite a bit better. So I think it's probably a C- in the Otters deck, and probably just a card you're looking to avoid in all other spaces. Our next card is Frilled Sparkshooter. This is 3 in a red for a 3/3 Lizard Archer, Menace Reach. When this enters, it enters with a 1/1 counter on it if an opponent has lost life this turn. So 4 mana 3/3 Menace Reach is a weird combination, and I think that you're probably not interested in this outside of the Lizard space, but I do think if you can easily trigger this, that 4/4 Reach has proven to just be a good stat line on its own. But with the Menace, it can also potentially be a trigger fodder in the future for your other opponent lost life effects. So I think this is an okay card within that Lizard space, but ultimately that's a lower costed deck in general, so you probably don't want too many of these. So I think overall this is probably a C level card, and then everyone else who's not Lizards is probably trying to avoid this. You feel like if you had that card, you already lost the game. That's very fair. That is very fair. All right, our next card is Kindle Spark Duo. This is 2 in a red for a 1/3 Lizard Otter. You can tap this, deal 1 damage to an opponent. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, untap this card. So I think this card is very obviously something you want to avoid, and I don't think that anyone is very often something you want to avoid, and I don't think really anyone is interested in this card, because we did see a card very similar to this within Wilds of Eldraine, and that card was only good when combined with Curiosity off of the bonus sheet, because it allowed you to draw a card every time you activated this, and so I think that just makes this card dead on arrival, and probably just an F. Next card we have is Might of the Meek. This is 1 red instant. Target creature gains trample until end of turn. It also gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If you control a mouse, draw a card. Wow, this is a beating. If you are in the mice deck, you're paying 1 mana to gain trample and 1 attack while also drawing a card and triggering your Valiant. So I think this is a card that is probably just a C+ within the red-white mice space. And even in the Lizard deck, it's probably still just a C, because trample and drawing a card is pretty good, considering that your effects thrive off your opponent losing life and you pushing through damage. Pretty self-explanatory, just good card overall. 1 mana card draw with an additional bonus is always going to be really good. All right, our next card is Raccoon Rallier. 1 in a red for a 2/2 Raccoon Bard. Tap target creature you control gains haste until end of turn. Activate only as sorcery. So, since you can only use this as a sorcery, it mitigates some of the potential value you have of triggering Valiant during your opponent's turn. So obviously they did it like that for a reason. I do think this is a good card in the red-white space. With the mice, I also think it could be beneficial in the red-green expend deck, because if you're playing a 4-cost creature, you could allow it to attack immediately, which could be fine, and 2/2 is nothing to be shy about. So overall, I think this is just a C-level card, probably best placed within the mice deck. Next card is Roughshod Duo, 2 in a red for a 3/2 Mouse Raccoon Trample. When you expend 4, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this card is cool. My issue is I don't really like the stat line for what you're getting. And essentially, if you're not expending 4 every turn, then this just isn't really worth it. And I think the thing about expend is, I don't know how consistently you're going to be going expending like 4 or 5 turns in a row. At some point, you're going to run out of gas, which tells me that this is like an okay card to include in that space, but probably not one you're prioritizing. And if you have better cards, you would probably prefer to keep this card on the sideline and not play it at all. So I'll go ahead and give it a C- for the expend space. And if you're not playing the expend deck, you're probably just not interested. Next up, we have Sazakap's Brew, 1 in a red instant. As an additional cost to the spell, you may discard a card. Target player draws 2 cards. If the gift was promised of gifting a tapped fish, target creature you control gets +2/0 until the end of the turn. So this is, I forgot what that effect is called, but I mean, it's 2 mana to discard a card and draw 2 cards, which I'm just not really sure anyone is too interested in. And the ability to gift someone a tapped fish to give your guy +2/+0, I just don't really think is worth it, because that ability is only beneficial within the red-white mice space, and within that deck, this doesn't help you advance your game state. You would much rather just be playing a 2-drop on the turn you're trying to discard a card and draw 2, which makes me think that, like, this is a D+ card within the red-blue spells deck, and probably just unplayable anywhere else. Our next card is Steam Path Charger. This is 1 in a red for a 2/1 Lizard Warlock with Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy, and when this dies, it deals 1 damage to target player. That's just a pretty good card. I think this is a great card in the Lizard deck. I think maybe even in the red-white deck, you're not too dissatisfied with this. Being able to guarantee a damage while also chomping is great in the Lizard space, because that's what your deck thrives on, and I think the body just isn't terrible. The added optionality really puts this up there, but it's not so high impact, so I'll go ahead and give this a C. Next card we have is Take Out the Trash. Oh shit, my boy the raccoon is out here, doing some necromancy with the trash. He's reviving all of the garbage that you guys forgot to recycle. Ha 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 ha. 1 in a red instant. Take Out the Trash deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If you control a raccoon, you may discard a card and draw a card. So 2 mana, deal 3 damage, and then if you have a raccoon, you get to loot. This card's great. I think you're happy playing this in any deck that's red, and I think you're very happy to play this within the expend space. So I think this is just a C+ card, and you're never cutting this from your deck, and you're very happy to have multiples of it. Great card. Next card is War Squeak. 1 red enchantment aura enchant creature. When this enters, target creature and opponent controls cannot block this turn. Enchanted creature has +1/+1 in haste. So for 1 mana, I am giving something 1/1 in haste, and then also a creature they control can't block. That's great. I love this card. Wow. I think this is just a C-level card. It's not like insanely high impact, but it does what you're wanting to do in the Lizard space, and equally so within the Mice space. I still think it's okay as well. More interested in this within the Lizard space, especially because Mice have a couple cards that already have haste, but I think it's still a fine inclusion, so I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Whisker Quill Scribe. 1 in a red with Valiant Mouse Citizen types, and it is 2/2. Whenever this becomes the target, you get to draw, 1 in a red, 2/2 Mouse Citizen. Whenever you Valiant, meaning you target this card for the first time, you can discard a card and draw a card. So 2 mana for a 2/2 with the potential to loot off the Valiant. And that's only once per turn. That's like okay. I think overall the Valiant mechanics is just very pushed. And so this is probably just a good card specifically based on that. Plus I think Mouse has one of the highest synergies like out of all creature types within this format. So I think this card is probably just a C-, and it doesn't really have to be that good because the synergies behind Mice are just so powerful. And you're probably never cutting this from your deck unless your deck is super premium. But other decks probably just aren't really interested in this. Next up, we have our first class card for red, Blacksmith's Talent. 1 red, when this enters, create an equipment named Sword with equipped creature gets +1/+1 and equipped for 2. Level 2, we can pay 2 in a red. At the beginning of combat on your turn, attach target equipment you control to up to 1 target creature you control. And then level 3 for 3 in a red. During your turn, equipped creatures you control have double strike and haste. Wow. That is excellent. That is absolutely excellent. I do want to reaffirm what is really good about this card is that even if you only have 1 equipment and it's already equipped to a creature, you can just re-equip the same creature that is already equipped every single turn and trigger that creature's Valiant ability, which makes this card absolutely insane. And if you have other equipment, like for example, if you have the... there's the Mythic Sword in this set. I forget if it's Sword of Feast and Famine or something, but if you have that, that's just broken. But overall, this card just has a really high floor. The only thing it doesn't have going for it is that, like, in the red-white deck, you already are trying to, like, spend all your mana every turn. So I don't know when it'll be, like, a great time to be leveling this up. But I do think it's a good card. It's probably just, like, a build around C+. Moving on, we have Blooming Blast. This is 1 in red instant, deal 2 damage to target creature, and then you can gift a treasure, and if you did so, it also deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. This card is absolutely excellent. This is easily a C+. I mean, 2 to deal 2 is really good in this format where everyone's toughness is very, very low on average, with the opportunity cost of being able to deal 3 damage to their face, making this a Searing Flames. The red-white deck is very interested in this, and potentially the Lizard deck, because you might even be willing to give them a treasure in the mid-game just to trigger your other opponent losing life effects. So overall, this is just a great card, and it's an easy C+ for me. Next up, we have Brambleguard Captain. This is 3 in a red for a 2/3 mouse soldier. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature gets +X/+O until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. So worst case scenario, you target this with its own effect. At that point, it is then a 4 mana 4/3. With the optionality to continuously trigger your other Valiant cards, as well as it having the mouse type, which is very synergistic within the red-white space. I think this is probably going to be a C+, because within the red-white deck, which is shaping up to be one of the strongest archetypes in the format, being able to continuously proc your Valiant cards without paying mana is absolutely excellent, and I think the floor on this is relatively decent, being a 4 mana 4/3. So I actually really like this card, and I'm excited to see how it pans out. Next up, we have Brazen Collector, which is 1 in red for a 2/1 Raccoon Rogue with First Strike. When this attacks, add a red mana until end of turn. You don't lose that mana as steps and phases end. Wow. This card is great. I play this card on turn 2 within the expend deck. On turn 3, I'm attacking with First Strike. They don't block it. I get in. I gain my red. Now on turn 3, I'm able to play 4-costed creature and trigger my expend. I love this card within the Raccoon space. You're probably fine to play this within the Lizard space as well, just because 2 mana with First Strike can allow you to accelerate your potential to trigger an opponent losing life. And, you know, just being able to use that red mana in main phase 2 in those aggressive decks is very easily as equally beneficial as it is to the expend deck. So I actually really like this card, probably going to be in high demand. So I'm going to say that this is a C+, and just an overall versatile card that you're happy playing in pretty much any of the 3 aggressive red decks. Yeah, that guy's beautiful. The art, okay, put some respect on the artwork. This is nice. One thing I will say about this deck, about this set, is although it's very basic, a lot of these cards have goated artwork. All right, next up, we have Coruscation Mage. Shout out to me for the butchering. 1 in a red for a 2/2 Otter Wizard with Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy. When you cast a non-creature spell, this deals 1 damage to each opponent. This card is excellent. This is the exact kind of card that I'm looking for within the red-blue spell space. I'm either paying 2 mana to start pinging my opponent with my spells, or I'm paying 4 mana to double ping my opponent with my spells. If I'm playing this on 4 and Offspringing on 5, I could potentially just deal 6 damage to them, not including the potential damage from the spells themselves, especially if you have the Otter that is the red-blue gold card, reducing your spells by 1. I think this is probably a build around B-. And honestly, you're probably decently happy playing this in your Lizard deck, depending on how many non-creature spells you have, because it is a potential easy way to trigger your opponent losing life that turn. Yeah, this card is great and versatile, and we love to see it. Easy B-. Next up, we have Flame Cache Gecko. This is 1 in a red for a 2/2 Lizard Warlock. When this enters, if an opponent lost life this turn, you get to add a red and a black mana, and then you can pay 1 in a red to discard a card, draw a card. So the floor of this card is that you're just a 2 mana 2/2 with the potential to loot, which is fine. And then the ceiling of this card is that you gain the 2 mana and you use it to play a more impactful game piece. And then like the middle ground of this is that you use that 2 mana to loot. I think this card has a lot to offer in form of its versatility. And I actually really like that you get a red and a black, because that could very easily fix your mana. If the way you were making your opponent lose life was by using only red mana, it could potentially like unlock you from not having a black, which I think is really realistically very important in these aggressive decks, where you missing a land drop of a specific color could easily put you too far behind to lose the game. So I think this card is great. I think I'm probably just going to give it a C+ in the Lizard deck, and then anyone else just isn't really interested in this. I guess it's probably a D+ within the red-blue space, and you'd probably be decently okay just playing 1 of this, because looting could be okay within that deck. But overall, it's just a fun card. I love it. The fact you get a black is just goated. All right, our next card is Harnesser of Storms. This is 2 in a red for a 1/4 Otter Wizard. When you cast a non-creature or Otter spell, you may exile the top of your library. Until the end of turn, you may play that card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Wow. This card is excellent. I'm just going to go ahead and give this a build around B-. It does cost 3. But you make up for that with it having 4 toughness, which I think was the perfect way to go about this card. The fact that you don't just have to cast an instant and sorcery, you can also cast artifacts, you can also cast enchantments, or you can cast Otter spells. That is absurd. Because when we consider this, if you are in the red-blue space, ideally, the only creatures in your deck are going to be Otters. So when we take that into consideration, if we built around this, this card says whenever you cast any spell, you get to exile the top card of your deck and play that card this turn. And it has a very thick booty to where our opponent cannot easily kill it. This card is great. Honestly, I'm going to give this a B. It is just a build around B. The card is great. I don't know that really anyone else is interested in this. Maybe in the expend deck, depending on how your deck shapes up. I do think some of the Otter cards overlap with the expend deck, and so I think you could be in a situation where you put this in the expend deck just because you have a decent amount of Otter creature cards, not just because you're playing like non-creatures, right? But I think this is a great card, and I'm very excited to draft the red-blue spells deck, so let me know what you guys are most excited for as well. Next up, we have Heartfire Hero. This is 1 red for a 1/1 Mouse Soldier with Valiant, meaning the first time that this is targeted each turn, put a 1/1 counter on it. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. I think it's funny that they say each because I don't think you're really playing this in Commander. Let's be real, you're probably not doing that unless you're some degen mono red player. But I do think this card is insane. I think this is a high priority card within the red-white deck. The fact that you can just keep growing this is good on its own. You grow this one time and it's already paid for itself tenfold. And then if it's already at 2/2 and it dies and you're dealing 2 to something, you're so far ahead. Like doing 2 to the enemy and then also trading this for a game piece that costed more than your card. This card's great. I think this is a B-, specifically because I think this card is really strong in the red-white space, but I don't think anyone else is really interested in it. Maybe there's some potential for this in the Lizard deck, but I think that's really relevant to how many cards you have that can target this. Like if you have like 4 to 5 like combat tricks or like abilities that can target it, it's probably relatively good in the Lizard deck as well, but it's just kind of dependent on how your deck shapes up, right? Next up, we have Hoarder's Overflow. This is 1 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever it enters and whenever you expend 4, put a stash counter onto it. And then you can pay 1 and a red and sack this, discard your hand, then draw cards equal to the number of stash counters on Hoarder's Overflow. So essentially what you're telling me is this is a worse version of Bomat Courier. Because in fact, it is not Bomat Courier. It's just a piece of fucking garbage. And it also costs 2 mana. I mean, I think this is easily said. This is just a terrible card. Like, this is so bad. So you're telling me that, like, in the expend deck, my goal is to play that gold card on 2 that allows me to be able to, not even just the gold card, but also the other guy who gives you a red mana and you don't lose it. Those are like my 2 good 2-drops I'm trying to prioritize. And I'm taking my turn off to play this, so then I can't expend on the next turn. And then I expend 1 time, and then I don't have enough mana to even use the ability, and we go to turn 5, and I expend, and I don't have enough mana to use this ability. When the fuck are you actually doing this? Like, this is so ass. Like, I'm not gonna lie. The expend thing, like, making this relatively, like, difficult to accrue counters quickly, this card should have costed 0 to use the sacrifice ability. Like, that is actually just such a miss. This is so garbage. I mean, it's literally a picture of garbage. I mean, this is just an F. No one wants this, and this is a bigger... Oh, no, right. This is the second biggest L that Wizard has made in the past year outside of the Pinkertons. All my OGs know about the Pinkertons, man. All right, next up is Playful Shove. This is 1 and a red sorcery, deal 1 damage to any target, draw a card. Okay? Well, I'm trying to evaluate this similarly to how Flick a Coin was within Wilds of Eldraine or Rat Out. And the issue with that is those cards were both instant. Now, this card does cost 1 less than Flick a Coin, but we need to see what is the overall metrics of how many things have 1 toughness. We know this kills Offspring. We know this kills some Rabbit tokens. But it is sorcery, and that really inhibits this card. My assumption is that this is a C- level card that you probably would like to replace because the removal in red is very premium, but you don't mind playing this. And I think if you were able to get these with a relatively late conservative pick, it is probably a very good sideboard card because some of the more aggressive decks do have 1 toughness, such as the red-white deck, and in that space, I think it is pretty decent. So I think it's more of a sideboard card than anything, but if 1-drops are as relevant, or I mean 1 toughness creatures are as relevant as it was in Wilds of Eldraine, I think this goes up higher on my list, but we're going to give it a C- for now. Just because we've seen how good the removal is. All right, next up is Quake Tusk Boar. This is the red elemental. It is 3 red for an elemental boar creature. 5/5, reach, trample, haste.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
This card is amazing. I'm not going to lie. This card is cracked. you're going to want this in any of the aggressive red deck, and the haters will say, well, you're trying to be low to the ground, actually. Fuck that. This card is insane. 5/5 with haste and trample is already okay. The fact you get reach is just absurd. And honestly, my biggest skepticism about this format is that it feels like everything just randomly has reach. And so, like, I do think that, like, the blue-white flying deck looks cool, but the fact that it's already hindered by needing to have people on the ground to buff up with your flyers, and then everyone just gets secret reach, it kind of feels like the flying decks are going to be at a disadvantage. Like, I feel like it'll be relatively difficult to utilize the bat deck, just because that deck's about, being able to trigger your lifelink and use guys in the air. And when everything just has secret reach, it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to as consistently do that. But I think this card's going to be in relatively high demand. It's just a good curve topper in any of the red decks. I think it's good in every red deck. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a B. Just because there's not a single red deck that would feel bad about picking this. And this is a very conservative pack one, pick one card that I just don't think you can go wrong with if there's not a bomb in the pack. Gonna run 2 of these in all your deck? Yeah, this card's crazy. This card is absolutely disgusting. Next up, we have Rabid Gnaw. This is 1 in a red instant with an additional +1/+0. This card is great. This is easily a B- level removal because of its versatility. And in a format like this, I think a lot of people, I want everyone who watches my content to do well. And one thing I want you to think about in this format is tribal formats are usually relatively low skill in terms of the drafting experience compared to sets like MH3, where pivoting is a very valuable skill to master. Pivoting is going to be very difficult in this format, not only because there aren't really many incentives to go into 3-color decks, there's also very little fixing, and most of the cards are parasitic, meaning that, like, in the Valiant deck, you really don't want to be messing with things outside of Valiant. Stuff like that. Like, you don't really want to be messing with the Threshold and mixing it with the Forge stuff, because they're just parasitic. Like, once you get one of one thing, the best thing you can do is just keep picking cards that go with it, because it drastically increases your value. And what I want you to think about is cards like this, they go in any single deck. Now, this card is obviously great in the Valiant deck because, you're able to trigger Valiant and also bite something, and you're able to Valiant during the other person's turn, and it just has a picture of a mice in it. It has a picture of a mouse in it, so, like, even if you're brain dead, you understand, oh, mice in picture, I pick card. But, like, I'm happy to play this in the Expend deck because the creatures are great, and they're cards that want to be fighting with my opponent's cards. I'm also happy to be playing this in the Lizard deck. Maybe you're not the most interested in this in the red-blue spells deck, specifically because you would prefer to minimize the amount of creatures that you have within that space. But if you have a decent amount of creatures, it's still just a good card. So what my point is, cards like this, you should be keeping your eye out for. And early in the draft, these are the kind of cards that if there's not a bomb, I'm looking to start with these. This card, the boar, because no matter what is being passed to me, whatever is open, this gives me the option to go into that space because the floor is relatively high on this card, and any red deck, you're not going to be mad about playing this. So I think this is easily a B- level removal. It's the fact that this is an instant that makes this great. Couple more cards left to go in red. We have Reptilian Recruiter. 3 red for a 4/2 Lizard Warrior trample. When this enters, target creature, if that creature's power is 2 or less, or if you control another lizard, gain control of that creature until end of turn, untap it, and it gains haste. So this is unlike a Zealous Conscript, which has haste on its own. This doesn't have haste, but it does get trample, and then whenever your taking gets haste, you don't have to sacrifice anything, so there are some ups to that. I think for the most part, you would assume that this could be playable inside the red-white decks, but I think the cost itself really mitigates the potential of you doing that. And as well in the Lizard deck, you would also prefer to be relatively low cost in general. But I do think the advantage of you controlling a Lizard drastically increases the ceiling of this card. So in the Lizard decks, you're probably looking for like one of this, two of this. You probably want like 2 5-drops maximum in the Lizard space just because of how low cost it is, which makes this card kind of like a commodity that's going to be more in supply than it is going to be in demand, because you would also probably just prefer to be playing the 5/5 boar that has reach, haste, and trample. So I think this card's okay, and it's probably just a C minus, specifically because only Lizards want it, and this is kind of a contested, unneeded slot within that space in order for you to perform successfully. Like, you don't need to have a 5-drop in the Lizard deck to have a good Lizard deck. That's what I'm assuming. Maybe I will be completely off, and I would love to be proved wrong, but that is my assumption going into this format. Up next, we have Teapot Slinger. This is 3 in a red for a 3/4 Raccoon Warrior with Menace. When you expend 4, this deals 2 damage to each opponent, okay? So, do I get to do 2 damage whenever I play this card, since it is triggering expend, or as soon as I tap the mana before my card is entered the battlefield, would expend be already procced? Because that does slightly change how I feel about this card. If that's not the case, it's still just a good card. Like, don't get me wrong. The floor on this card is relatively high because 3/4 with Menace is still just fine for 4 mana. It is also Raccoon type, which makes me relatively more interested in it. But since it has Menace, essentially after I play this, every turn after, I'm getting in for 5 damage with a 4-costed card. I mean, I think I'm relatively interested in that, regardless of whether the question I'm asking is actually true or not. So I think this is probably a C+ card. I think it's good in the Raccoon expend deck, but I think generally speaking, you're just looking for cards that have a reward for expending within that deck. I don't know that it necessarily matters which ones it is. You just want as many of those as possible. So with that regard, I don't know that this is really separating itself from the pack from the other cards within that space, but it is a good card, so I think C+ is fair. And then I think, like, you could consider this within the Lizard deck because dealing 2 to the other player is fine. It kind of just depends, once again, what the roadmap of your deck is. But overall, a fine card, and I'm cool with C+. You want the boar? Yeah, the boar is dope. Next up, we have Valley Rain. This is 2 in a red instant. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. And if you promise your opponent a food, target creature you control gains first strike until end of turn. Okay, so at base value, this is 3 mana to give everyone +2/+0 until end of turn, with an additional optionality to then give one creature first strike. So, knowing what we know from our experiences in Wilds of Eldraine, I actually played Rats, one of the most out of like all people on 17 lands, and I very strongly performed well with the 3 mana spell that gave everyone +2/+0, and then when a creature died, create a rat token. That card was very integral to my games, and it was a card that, if you had the opportunity, you would prefer to have 1 copy of this effect within that space. And I think the red-black Rats deck plays out very similar to how the red-white deck is shaping up to be in this format, which makes me think that this is a card that, just like in Wilds of Eldraine, if you have the opportunity, you would prefer to pick up 1 copy of this just because it's a way to end the game whenever you see it. cards like this that have a limited play window, but have such a high impact that when you are able to play it within that window, you auto win the game, are typically a high commodity. And putting this card at uncommon over common means that you're probably going to have to prioritize it slightly higher. And you probably are okay with this within the lizard space as well, but definitely a high preference to utilizing this within the red-white space. And maybe just the aspect of being able to trigger Valiant actually improves this to a C+ versus the C that it was in Eldraine, specifically because there is that one mice card that has Valiant give all other mice +1/+0, and that card is relatively easily gotten if red-white is open, which means that essentially you're giving everything +3/+0, which makes this card really absurd, and the ceiling is very high. So I'm going to go with C+ inside the red-white deck. It's also just a C to C-. Moving on to our final red card here, we have Wildfire Howl. This is 1 red for a sorcery. This is 1 red for a sorcery. This deals 2 damage to each creature, and then if you gift your opponent a card, it is 2 damage to... Okay, this is a really weird card. I'm going to reread this. So this is 3 mana to deal 2 damage to each creature. If the gift was promised, instead, deal 1 damage to any creature and 2 damage to each creature. All right, let me tell you, this was such a terrible way to put the text on this card. Why would they not just say, if the gift was promised, also deal 1 damage to any target? Why would you restate what was just stated within the text? Okay, regardless. So you're paying 3 mana to deal 2 damage to everything, and then if you give them a card, you also get to deal 1 damage to anything. I feel like very often, you're never going to gift them a card. That just seems like such a terrible exchange of value, because when you think about it, the value and opportunity cost behind this card is that it's good versus aggro, bad versus control. And it's bad if you are an aggro player. So typically the only space for this is going to be if you're playing control. Maybe you're playing the red-blue spells deck. Maybe you're playing the red-green expend deck, and so your creatures are a little bit bigger. And if that's the case, you probably sideboarded it in versus those aggressive decks, which typically are going to have lower toughness, meaning that this, if you're going to put this in the deck, it should be killing most of their creatures whenever you play it, meaning that the deal in additional damage in exchange for a card is probably pretty low impact, because when you just wipe someone's board, giving them a card is one of the only ways that they can come back from that exchange. So I think you should just ignore the gift part. And if you're playing a control deck or a deck like the expend deck where your creatures are just going to be bigger, then I think you should put this card in the side deck. And if it just turns out that red-white and maybe red-black are just the best 2 decks in the meta, and like people are actively forcing them, then you could main deck 1 copy of this. But more likely than anything, it's just a sideboard card. I think it's a C-level sideboard card because it kind of annihilates those 2 archetypes I just stated, but everything else, it's like, it's negatively affecting you. But that's going to wrap it up for the red cards. We are now going to take a short break while I pull up all of the green cards. How do we feel about these cards so far, chat? So far, I don't know how many people have seen my review of white and blue, but I tend to think that starting off in white is so far my highest priority color. If I can start off in white, I feel very good. Just because it feels like white just has the most premium cards on average. Like, there are not a lot of filler level cards for white, which makes me feel that if white can probably most easily support multiple players. That's my thought process. Maybe red too. You know, like I was saying with the red-green deck, it feels like you don't necessarily just need like specific guys who give expend buffs. it seems like you just want as many of those cards that give you value for expending 4 as possible, and it may not matter which ones you have, right? You just want as many as possible, so as long as they're going around the table, you're probably decently satisfied with that. Man, I'm excited for green. I don't know if you guys know this, but any long-term watcher of the channel know that green is my favorite color in draft. And I actually really love the draft sets the most that are 3 color. And reason I like it whenever green is usually terrible, but I love the sets like Modern Horizons 3. I loved it because they actually found a way to make green blue good, which has not been true in like any other set I've ever played. And also, green has the highest potential to be able to allow you to play these 3 to 5 color wacky decks, which are very fulfilling to put together. And so I'm very excited to try to do that. But in this format, like, you can't really do that, which is very unfortunate. You got to be doing boring things, and the fixing is terrible, which makes me lead to believe that there's probably one good color pair with green, and all the other ones are like low priority. If it's available, you do it. If not, don't do it. I'm assuming that green-black is probably just the thing to be doing, and then other than that, you're probably just doing it if it is available to you. But I feel like the essence of green-black seems relatively strong, specifically because when you look at it at face value, forage is very similar to the aspect of the bargain mechanic from Wild's Veldrain, which proved out to be the most powerful mechanic over that entire duration of the set, right? But let me know what you guys are thinking so far about this format. What colors do you like? What do you not like? And what archetypes are you feeling? Let me go ahead and fill up my water real quick before we start. All right, we are back for our final. All right, we are back to review our final color of the day, the green common and uncommons, and we will be doing the rares and mythic on the very next episode. So starting off with our first green common, we have Baker's Bane Duo. This is 1 and a green for a 2/2 Squirrel Raccoon. Whenever it enters, create a food token. Whenever you expend 4, he gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. Wow, I love this card. To be honest, I'm very much more interested in playing this card within the forage space, being green-black, than I am red-green. And that's specifically just because I feel like the food part of this card is more impactful than it is the +1/+1 until end of turn. I understand why they didn't make it a 1/1 counter, but I think that's more of like a secondary effect, and maybe you will want this more highly in the expend decks if your potential to forage and expend overlap between those two themes, and this could be a good touch point between both of those mechanics. So overall, I really like this card, and I think I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Cash Grab. This is 1 in a green, and look at that awesome artwork. If you are watching over on the YouTube or on the stream, this card is absolutely amazing. We got a little squirrel chasing down an acorn here. It is an instant that says mill 4 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the milled cards this way into your hand, and then if you control a squirrel or return to squirrel to your hand, create a food token. So at base value, we are paying 2 mana to mill 4. Then we are going to add back a permanent card from the grave to our hand. And if we're adding back a squirrel, or we return to squirrel, or we control the squirrel, then we're going to also create a food. So I think the way that you should look at this card is by comparing it to a card from Modern Horizons 3 known as Malevolent Rumble. This card was an absolute all-star, and is said pay 1 in a green to be able to mill the top 4 cards of your deck and add a creature or a land, then create a Eldrazi spawn that essentially gave you an additional mana. I think the fact that this card is the exact same cost, essentially has the exact same effect, but also instead of getting an additional mana, you're getting a game object being the food, and this being a lower power level set. I think you're completely fine with that, and I think this card is absolutely amazing. If you consistently are able to generate the food from this, this is easily a B- level card. I think this is an awesome card to start out with at the beginning of the draft, and if you are in the forage space, this card is excellent. So I really love this card, and I'm excited to try it out. Next up, we have Druid of the Spade. This is a 2 and a green creature with the Rabbit Druid type that is 2/3, and as long as you control a token, he has +2/+0 and trample. So 3 mana for a 4/3 trample at its best, and 3 mana 2/3 at its floor. If you can consistently generate tokens in the early to mid portions of the game, this is a very solid card. 4/3 with trample is nothing to be shy about, and I think you're never cutting this from the Rabbit deck. I think even in the forage space, if you are consistently able to generate food tokens relatively quickly, this is also a solid playable within that space as well. So I think it would be a disjustice to give this anything lower than a C, maybe a C+, depending on how many ways you are able to generate rabbit tokens early. Rabbits and tokens within, the green-white rabbit space, yada, yada, yada. But the card's great. Let's move on. Next up, we have Heaped Harvest. This is 2 and a green for an artifact food whenever it enters, and whenever you sacrifice it, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then you may sacrifice this for the food ability as well. So at face value, you're paying 3 to go ahead and ramp a land, and then if you sacrifice it, you are ramping a second land. So this is actually one of the only ways to consistently enable splashing within this format outside of 2 color pairings. And I feel like maybe you're wanting to splash, like the green black space seems like the space where you're going to be wanting to splash the most, because you also get the most value out of this food. So maybe you use this as a way to facilitate a bomb from another color pair. And I think that's probably the highest ceiling of this card. Some people will argue that doing this on turn 3 is too late, to where like the ramp isn't as beneficial to you, and I can understand that, but the fact it comes in as a food has some innate synergies associated with it. So I think its value is very much determined on how many ways are you able to take advantage of a food token, and how urgently do you require that resource to fulfill your game plan. So I think this is probably a C-level card within the green-black space, and probably just no one else is interested in it at all. Next up, we have High Stride. This is 1 green for an instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 and reach until end of turn. Untap it. Once again, everyone just gets reach. Miss me with those flyers. I mean, let's be real. Everything freaking has reach. I guess flying just means nothing now. This card is bad. I mean, we saw a variation of this in Wild Veldrain, and you play that in your deck sometimes, but when you had the better combat tricks, it was always the first thing to cut. And considering this isn't within the color pairs of Valiant, it's even worse. So, and also just like reach is very accessible in this set, so it doesn't mean as much. I think this is a D+, and something you will try not to play. Next up, we have Longstalk Brawl. This is 1 green for a sorcery. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. Put a 1/1 counter on the creature you control. If you gifted your opponent a tapped 1/1 fish, then those creatures fight each other. So the floor of this card is a 1 mana sorcery speed fight spell, and the ceiling of this card is that you are able to trade away one of your game pieces without it dying for your opponents, winning that fight, and replacing it with a 1/1 tapped fish on their field, which I think this is one of the best situated gift cards that we have seen overall. I think the gift really isn't that detrimental to your opponent for what you're getting, because the tapped portion of them getting the token is what's really relevant about this being a cost you're more often willing to pay than not. Because let's say you're playing the red-green expend deck, and you have a creature that's like 4/4 and it has trample. You make it 5/5, you kill their creature, and you attack with that during that turn. Well, because the token is tapped, they don't get that value of like blocking. I know I just said the creature had trample, but you know what I mean. Like, it allows you to push through with people that same turn you fight, which is really good. I'm going to go ahead and give this a B-. I think every green deck is interested in this. 1 mana to be able to do that, I think that's great. Next up, we have Polywallop. This is 3 and a green for an instant, and it costs 1 colorless less to cast for each frog you control. Target creature you control deals damage equal to twice its power to target creature you don't control. So this is a double bite for at a floor of 4 mana and at a ceiling of 1 mana. I think that's pretty good considering it's an instant speed. I think you really need to have some amount of frogs to justify saying, I'm interested in this, I want to be doing this. But I think if you're in like a red-green deck, you can probably make the argument that, like, you know what, this is probably a fair playable. So I think within the green-blue frog space, this is a C+, and I think within the expend deck, it's probably a D+. Overall, very cool card. Next up, we have Rust Shield Rampager. This is 3 and a green for a 4/4 Raccoon Warrior, Offspring 2, creating a 1/1 copy of it. This creature can be blocked by creatures with 2 power or less. So, I think that this card is one that you are relatively not very interested in with any deck in specific, because I think you can just ignore the Offspring text on this, because creating a 1/1 that can't be blocked by creatures with 2 power or less from a 6 mana card really has very little impact on the board. I think the only reason you would play this is in the expend deck, going back to what I'm assuming is going to make the expend deck good or make a good expend deck, is just having as many cards that give you a bonus for expending and as many cards that allow you to efficiently expend as possible. And this is a fair way to do it. It's a very mid way to do it. So I think it's probably a C- level card within this expend space, and just a card that no one else really wants to play. Next up, we have Sticky Tongue Sentinel. This is 2 and a green for a 3/3 Frog Warrior with Reach. Whenever this enters, return up to one other target permanent you control back to your hand. Once again, the reach. Like, I understand the reach on this guy. It makes sense. He has a sticky tongue. But some of those other people with reach are just uncalled for. So, 3 mana, 3/3 reach, fair stats. That's fine. And then being able to blink one of your other frogs, great. I think this is a solid C+ within the frog space. Even if you're playing the green, blue, gold card on 2 that allows you to draw a card when it enters, and then playing this on 3 and getting to draw a second card, I think this card is well worth its weight. It is an easy way to enable the blink mechanic within the frog space with a relatively low cost. So I think this card is really good in the Frogs deck. C+ there, and anyone else is probably looking to not play it, but I do think it's passable in your other green decks, so as long as you have valuable ETBs, because the stat line is not bad at its lowest point. Next up, we have Sun Shower Druid. This is 1 green for a Frog Druid, 0 attack, 2 toughness. When it enters, put a 1/1 counter on target creature, and you gain 1 life. So I think in general, no one is interested in this outside of the green-blue Blink Frogs deck, which in that case, if you have relative ease to repeatedly blink this, it's probably okay. But in general, I think this is one of the lower impact incentives for trying to do that. It is a low-cost frog, which could reduce the cost of your Polywallop for a low-priced entry, which is fine. So within that space, I think it's a D+ and just an F in everything else. Next up, we have 3 Tree Root Weaver. This is 1 and a green for a 1/3 Mole Druid. Tap to add 1 mana of any color. I think this card is fine. I think this card is actually hindered slightly by the fact that there are not many incentives to be splashing outside of 2 color pairs. I think this card has the highest potential within the expend deck, as it does allow you to turn 3 be able to play 4 costs, turning off your expend stuff relatively quick, and the 3 toughness is quite relevant in this format, but I could as well see the green-black forge decks playing this card specifically because it can enable them to splash a bomb from a 3rd color, and this is one of the only ways to open your optionality to that. So overall, I think it's probably a C on average. C+ in the expend deck if your deck is like full on expend, because at that point, accelerating your ability to trigger those effects is relatively high impact in accordance with your game plan. Next up, we have Tree Guard Duo. This is 3 and a green for a 3/4 Frog Rabbit creature. Whenever it enters until end of turn, target creature you control gains vigilance and gets +X/+X. X is the number of creatures you control. So let's think about it like this. if you play the 2-cost gold card on for green-white on 2, and then you play the 3-cost white spell giving you 3/1/1 rabbits on 3, then you play this on 4, you now have 4 creatures on field, you target the 2-cost gold card, and then that's giving it +4/+4, and then it's already at 5/5, so then that becomes a 9/9 with Vigilance Trample. Holy shit, that's good. That's really good. I don't see that the Frogs deck really want this at all, because to my knowledge, the Frogs deck isn't like aggressive enough to really take advantage of the full ceiling to this card. I think this is just a secret gold card, being that it's most relevant within the green-white space, and then outside of that, I think you just like probably don't want it, but like the stat line is passable, so it's probably just a D+ everywhere else. But I think within the green-white space, depending on how your deck is laid out, like if you have the 3-cost spell giving you 3/1/1 tokens and, some amounts of the green-white common gold card like I was talking about, I think it drastically increases in your priority and how likely you are to want this commodity. So I'm going to go with a C+, just because it's only good in that one deck, but it has a very high ceiling, so I love cards like this. Next up, we have Treetop Sentries. This is 3 and a green for a 2/4 Squirrel Archer. Reach. When this enters, you may forage, and if you do, draw a card. So 4 mana for a 2/4 reach, and then you draw a card. Maybe it triggers something else. I think that's fine. I actually think I'm going to rate this card a C-, and my rationale is that after seeing how many things have reach, how many things enable reach, I think that that probably lowers my interest in a commodity like this just because there is a surplus of reach. Now, if that ends up not being the case and it's actually more difficult to acquire reach than I am making it seem like, I'm probably going to bump this up to a C, but I'm going to put this as a C- for that reason, because the reach is really what's partially carrying this card, and I also feel like one of the weaknesses of green, like especially, the forage deck, this is a squirrel, so it's going to be part of that, is probably going to be the red-white deck, which is mostly on the ground. So those are just my takes, but I could easily be wrong. The card could be better. It is important to note this is 4 cost, so you can gain some overlap between your forage and as well your expend. Next up, we have Bark Knuckle Boxer. This is a really awesome looking card. As many of you may know, I am a boxer, I am a mixed martial artist, and I do have a messed up nose to prove it. So me and this guy really resonate together. He is 1 and a green for a 3/2 Raccoon Berserker. When you expend 4, he gains indestructible until end of turn. Wow. This guy is very premium. 2 mana 3/2 is a very high floor, my good sir. Also being a raccoon, and then having a repeatable effect that basically guarantees my damage on a good statted attacker at a low cost. Great card. Love this card. I'm going to give this a C+ because I think it's really strong within the expend space, and I think you probably just don't want to play it in other decks, but I think you could make an argument that if you're low on playables, you might not cut it from a green-white deck, just because 3/2 on 2 isn't bad when you're trying to be mostly aggressively slanted. I think overall, if you can trigger this ability at least one time, the card is probably giving you more than what you originally paid for. Oh, it's also important to note with this card is that you can trigger expend 4 during the opponent's turn with a combat trick, and this can secretly kill something, which is pretty cool. Next up, we have Bramble Guard Veteran. This is 1 green for a 3/4 Raccoon Warrior. Whenever you expend 4, raccoons you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Well, that is great. So now I see the vision behind this. So we turn 2 Bark Knuckle Boxer into turn 3 Bramble Guard Veteran, and then on turn 4, we're going to be attacking with a 4/3 indestructible vigilance, and as well, we're going to be attacking with a 4/5 vigilance. The fact that this includes itself means this card has a very high floor. This card is great. Wow. I actually love this card. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a B- build around, because I do think that similarly to the frog uncommon that gives all frogs ward, I think just this ability on its own and the way that red-green is trying to play, this is just great. Because it promotes you for being aggressive, and vigilance is amazing in this archetype because these creatures are typically, trying to go over the head of those aggro decks. They typically have, 4 toughness on average because you're playing a lot of 4-drops. So I like this card a lot, and I'm going to go build around B-, although I don't think anyone else is realistically interested in this unless you just have a lot of raccoons from within the color green itself. Next up, we have Bushy Bodyguard. Oh my gosh, he's so cute and bushy, guys. 1 and a green for a 2/1 squirrel creature warrior offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy. When this enters, you may forage, and if you do, put 2 1/1 counters on it. Holy smokes, the ceiling on this card is out the wazoo. Number 1, you can potentially double forage, proccing your other effects. And then number 2, if you are able to do that, then the ceiling of this card is that you paid 4 mana for a 4/3 and a 3/3? Sign me up for that. That is absolutely absurd stats for the potential ceiling of this card. And then, the floor is relatively high too. Even if you can only use forage with this, still 2 mana 4/3. And at worst, it's a 2 mana 2/1, but has a very versatile play window. I think this card is great. This is one of the most premium offspring cards we have seen thus far. And I think the green-black deck is very much interested in this card and in multiple copies, as many as they can get their hands on. So I'm going to give this as well a build around B-. Now, I do think there are some additional implications to this within an expend space if you do have ways to create foods, because when you use the offspring cost, it is an additional cost. It is not an ability, which means that you can expend 4 and probably create some overlap between the two strategies, which also, from what we've seen thus far, makes me think that the green-black and green-red decks are probably the ones that you are most likely to end up splashing into a 3-color deck with. I'm very interested to see how that pans out, so if I end up being wrong about that, make sure to come back to this video and let me know how much I suck at this game. JK, I'm the boat, baby. Next up, we have Clifftop Lookout. This is 2 and a green for a 1/2 Frog Scout with Reach. Whenever this enters, reveal cards from your library until you reveal a land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest to the bottom of your library in any order. Great card. Really great card. I'm loving the potential to be able to splash into a 3rd color in a base green deck that has ramp/fixing cards no one else can really play, which means my dream to be able to play a 3 or 4 color deck might just be alive. Make sure to stay tuned and look out for more videos to see if I can actually accomplish this feat, because it's looking really difficult to make happen. But enough about that. This card is great. I'm going to have to give this card a C+, because virtually any green deck has a relative to, decently high interest in this card, depending on your curve, and it can fix your mana, and, everybody just gets Reach. That's the new thing. Everybody gets Reach. That's just how it goes. But this really promotes that overlap between, maybe a green-blue frog deck and maybe as well a green-black forge deck. Who knows? Only time will tell. But I'm going to lock this guy in as a C+, because he is versatile and very good at his job. Next up, we have Curious Forager. This is 2 and a green for a 3/2 Squirrel Druid. Whenever he enters, you may forage, and when you do, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and retract everything I said good about the previous cards we evaluated, which allowed you to buy back things from the graveyard, outside of that 2-cost card that was essentially Malevolent Rumble 2.0, because this just allows you to buy back things at such a better rate than the cards that costed 4 in black and made you, lose life and made you lose so much tempo. This card gives you a fair stat line as well as the ability to buy something back, which tells me this is the most efficient way to be buying things back in this format. And as well with the other Forge synergies, this is just a overall solid card. And I think in the right deck, this is a C+ solid card. Now, not everyone is going to be interested in this card, but in the decks you can facilitate it. I think it is pretty good, And I think this is another one of those cards where the value just increases the more potential bombs you were able to draft into that deck. Overall, I'm super excited to play with green thus far. Next up, we have Green's Elemental, and it is Gale Wind Moose. This is 4 green for a Elemental Elk 6/6 Flash. Vigilance, Reach, hold up, I'm not done yet, let him cook, Trample. We're cooking, baby. This card is bonkers, baby. This card's insane. I'm not gonna lie, they finally did it. They finally found a way to power creep Colossal Dreadmaw. This card is absolutely beautiful. I think pretty much any green deck that has ramps such as the 1/3 that allows you to ramp 1, or even the red-green gold card that lets you ramp a red or a green, or even if you're playing that the lookout guy, like those decks are going to be very interested in this. Flash Reach, crazy combo. Vigilance Trample, another crazy combo. You're just getting so much for your buck with this, and I think you just can't go wrong as long as your curve supports the potential of putting this within the lineup. I think the card is great, and I wouldn't call it necessarily a build around, but I think it's just a B-. It's an easy B-. You're not necessarily building around it. It's just like, do you end up in a space where your highest cost card can be more than 4? If you're doing some shit like, for example, I know you can't play this in this deck, but if you're playing Lizards and all your cards are 3 or less, you can't play this. If you can play it, you're going to want to take this and in high commodity, because the card just offers you so much for the amount of mana you're paying. Probably my second favorite or first favorite elemental that we have seen from all the cards. And I'm actually really happy about these because I think it was important to add in some cards that overlap between all the archetypes so that it doesn't feel so punishing when you just get locked into a color pair and have very little potential chance to pivot because the fixing is relatively non-existent. Next up, we have Hazard Root Herbalist. 2 and a green for a 1/4 Rabbit Druid. When you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If that creature is a token, it also gains Death Touch. Wow. That is cool. I don't think this card's insane, but I think it's really cool. And honestly, I think this card is really good in the green-white deck for 2 reasons. Number 1, green-white is the space where you want to be possessing tokens. Number 2, this has some overlap between playing the strong white Valiant cards, because it is a consistent way to be able to target those Valiant cards without spending mana. Since you do not have to singly target a rabbit, you can target Valiant cards, get their effects, which I think there are just some strong Valiant cards overall. So I really like this card, and I think I'm going to give it a C+ for the red-white deck in specific. And I think no one else is just really interested in this, but you do have to we'll give it a synergy C, because you do have to have the moving pieces to work for you, but when it works out, the ceiling on this seems relatively high. Next up, we have Hive Spine Wolverine. This is another elemental, and it is 3 and double green for a Wolverine with 5/4, and whenever it enters, you can choose 1. Put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control, which can include this card, or it fights target creature token, or you can destroy an artifact or enchantment. Man, I love the versatility on this card. I think that the red-green expend deck is very moderate to high interested in this card. I think the green-blue deck is potentially equally interested in this card, and maybe even the green-black deck. Very versatile card. All 3 of these effects are very good. The floor of this card is that you're paying 5 mana for a 6/5, which is like, okay, that's fine. If I have the mana to support this, this is great. Or you're killing an offspring token, or you're killing, a banishing light, maybe one of their class cards. Great card, and I think this card is probably a B- as well. It's just good and everything, and the amount of optionality it has means it can really only be so bad. Next up, we have Honored Dray Leader. This is 2 and a green for a 1/1 Squirrel Warrior with Trample. Whenever it enters, put a 1/1 counter on it for each other squirrel and or food you control. When another squirrel or food enters, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Holy smokes, this is bonkers. Wow. Another one of those reverse lords where it gets bigger based on the other stuff. Your other stuff doesn't get bigger based on it. So, very interesting card. I think the Trample was a great touch for this. And I actually really like the approach that they took with this card. I think that the stat line, as well as the potential to grow, is very evenly balanced. I mean, typically, it's going to be very easy for you to play down a squirrel. For example, the green-black gold card is a squirrel that whenever it enters, creates a food token. So if you just play that card into this, it is minimum a 3/3 with Trample, and with the potential to grow after that. And I think the potential to grow after it is already entered is really what just makes this card a standout. And I think, honestly, this could be a build around B- within the squirrel space. Within the foraging green-black space, it could be a build around B-. I think at worst it's a C+, but I'm going with my hunch here. I'm gambling all the marbles on this green-black food deck, and we're going to go with the B-. Couple cards left to go here, so stay with me, guys. Make sure to get till the end of the video so that you get the most value. We have Hunter's Talent. This is a green class card, which is 1 and a green. Level 1, whenever this enters, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to another creature you don't control. So it is a bite spell for 2 mana, already very good. Level 2, by paying 1 and a green. Whenever you attack with anything, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Fair and efficient. Level 3, you can pay 3 and a green. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. I think the amount of sheer value this card gives you is very evident and very self-explanatory. Also, considering the amount of overlap this just has as a generally high-value card amongst all green archetypes, it's easy to say the worst this could be is a build around B-. I think this is probably going to be a build around B, just because how much it can snowball you out of the game. Like, I would pay 2 mana to just be able to bite something. Like, that's already a C. And then get these 2 abilities that give me an infinite value engine. Sign me up for that. This card is great. I'm just going to lock in a B overall. I think the card is just very strong. And if I started with this pack 1, pick 1 in the Pro Tour, I have a clear goal in mind, which is something I really like about drafting. And I have a high set of rewards for doing what I'm trying to look for in the draft. So very excellent card. I think that's probably the best glass card that we've seen at the common and uncommon level. Next up, we have Overprotect. This is 1 in a green instant. Target creature you control gets +3/+3, gains trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. Wow. They just give you everything. This is like the only thing that they give you that does not present reach. That's actually hilarious. This is the one card that you would think gives you reach but doesn't. I mean, the fact that you get hexproof and indestructible makes this pretty high priority for me. I'm going to go with C+. I think this might be one of the best like combat tricks in general we've seen thus far at the common and uncommon rarity, just because it's like the floor is so high. Like, it's just such a versatile card, and if your deck is creature dense, you can't be that upset about having to play one of these. Next up, we have Paw Patch Formation. This is 1 in a green instant. Choose one. You can destroy a creature with flying, destroy an enchantment, or you can draw a card and create a food. I think this is the standard plummet type card that we see in these sets, where it has a potential ability to, kill a flyer, and then it also has like some kind of bonus. I think this one's a little bit better because killing enchantments seems somewhat relevant, probably more relevant than, killing artifacts. And then worst case, you can just create a food. I think the third option makes this card more safely main deckable within the green-black space. So I think, hot take here, the first copy, you actually are going to be more rewarded for main decking within the green-black forage space. And then after that, you're just going to want to side deck them. And in any other strategy, you just want to side deck them. But I actually really like this take on a plummet effect, because typically those cards are so fringe and it just feels bad when the guy sides it in against you, or he's main decking the one copy in best of one and you're like, oh shit, he had it. At least with this, it's like, oh, I understand why he's main decking that. There is some good synergies with foods. You also get enchantments. One of my favorite plummet effects seen in the history of Magic and Draft. So yeah, I'm just gonna go with a C level card, maybe a C plus for the green-black food deck, depending on how dependent you are on food. 2 mana is just a good price to pay for that. Next up, we have Peerless Recycling. This is 1 in a green, return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand, and if you gift them a card, instead return 2 cards from your graveyard to your hand, and those have to be permanents. So 2 mana to return anything from my grave at instant speed, and if I give them a card, I get to return 2 things. That's good. I think this card is kind of somewhat contested by the raccoon card that just does that. But in decks that are not raccoons, you're probably more interested in this piece, because the raccoon card required you to sacrifice a food. So this one, I guess, is more versatile, but probably like lower ceiling on average. This is one of those cards that I just think it depends on, like, okay, how interested am I buying back things? Am I sacking things? Do I have bombs that are important to me? If either of those are a yes, I'm interested in this. If not, I probably don't. I'm going to go with C level because I think it's very dependent on what you have going on with your deck and the way the draft went for you. But I do actually like this combination of gifting. Next up, we have Stalking the Pantry. This is 1 green for an enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more 1/1 counters on a creature you control, you can put a supply counter on the pantry. Then you can pay 2 to remove a supply counter and draw a card. Excellent card, excellent build around potential. Easy, I'm slamming the B- build around button, chat. This card is absolutely amazing and sounds so fun. So far, if you've gotten to this point in the video, then you know there are quite a bit of 1/1 counter synergies in green, especially within the forge space, and I think that should tell you where this is going. I think this is best used within the green-black space because it seems like that's like the most value-oriented, green deck that we've seen. Maybe the green-blue space as well. I will say the green-blue space could be good too. I just feel like in the green-black space, you're more willing to pay the 2 mana, but I could be wrong. I haven't gotten to play yet, so we'll just have to see. But those are the 2 candidates to where I think you most want this card, since the expend people, they don't really want this because abilities don't count towards expend. But I do really like this, and I'm interested to play with it. I'm going to give it a build around B-. Second to last card here, we have 3-Tree Scribe. 1 in a green, 1 in a green for a Frog Druid, 2/3. Whenever this enters or another creature leaves the battlefield, whenever this card or another creature you control leaves the battlefield without dying, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Wow. This is a very, very strong incentive to be doing the green-blue blink thing. And I think for that reason, this is probably just a build around B- within the green-blue space. Outside of that, no one else is interested in it. But if you have ways to facilitate, exiling things and bringing them back, just getting an additional 1/1 for free is great. And the floor on this is relatively high. 2 mana, 2/3 is not bad in a very aggressive format where people are trying to play haste creatures, play 1 attack, 2 attack guys. I love this card, and I'm very interested in the green-blue frog deck. So yeah, we're going to go with the build around B- within the frog space. Final card of the day, we have Wear Down. This is 1 in a green for a sorcery. Destroy target artifact or enchantment, and if you promise your opponent a card, instead destroy 2 artifacts or enchantment. This is an easy sideboard card so far from what we have seen outside of the rare and mythics, which we will be getting to next time. Artifact and enchantment removal doesn't seem to be the most important thing you should be worrying about in this format, and I don't know that you really want to be main decking a card that strictly interacts with those game pieces. But I do think this is the most sideboarded card we have seen thus far during the review. Now, I think honestly, unless you specifically need to answer artifacts, that variant of Plummet that could destroy an enchantment or give you a food and draw a card is probably the one that you would want in higher priority. But I do think there is a place and time for a piece of interaction like this. So we're going to go D+ sideboard card. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for our set review at the common and uncommon rarity. If you happen to miss out on part 1, it is available on the channel where we go over the gold uncommon and commons, and as well as the white and blue uncommon and commons, respectively. And next time, we will be doing the rares and mythics as we wrap up this set review series, and I will be working on trying to make a 17 lands tier list for anyone who is interested, just knowing my thought process on the pick order. And you can look forward to some early on videos from Burrow at its release point. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I want to thank you for getting this far because I know this was a long one. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to smash the like button, turn post notifications on, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another banger. Make sure to let me know down below, what are you most excited for in Burrow Limited? What is the thing that you want to do most so far? And as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.